So I did. I got an agent, and he ended up selling it to one of the publishers who rejected me. So
There's irony.
yeah, so that's how it worked out.
Well, that's wonderful. I wanted to touch on your newest one. I wanted to touch on Flesh Eaters for a moment. Flesh Eaters was just released
April 1st.
April 1st.
April 1st.
Okay.
Yeah.
April 1st. Joe, tell us about Flesh Eaters. Tell us.
When I wrote Dead City, the cause of the zombie outbreak was a bunch of hurricanes hit Houston, where I grew up, and flood the city. And we get all the chemicals from the Houston chemical refineries and the oil refineries, and all of the dead bodies that are rotting and so there's this chemical soup that kind of forms in the floodwaters, and arising from that with all the sewage and everything else, we get the zombie virus that ends up turning survivors into zombies, and so everything stems from that. When I wrote Dead City, I got to the end, and that story was about San Antonio, which is quite a distance from Houston, enough that we don't get hurricanes in San Antonio. We just get a decent rainstorm, and but I had left a great deal of that world untouched, and I knew eventually that I wanted to write a story. At the end of Dead City, everything is quarantined off. That area where the zombies originated, we'd set up quarantine walls, and the problem is contained within those walls. But because everything was evacuated on such a disorganized kind of way, there were all of the museums and banks and jewelry stores and anything that has a readily liquefiable cash product that was left there inside the quarantine zone. And Houston has a lot of banks, just like any other major city, and there's untold millions of dollars, just a fortune waiting to be had, to quote Judas Priest. And anyway, that was in there underneath the floodwaters to anyone who was, one, brave enough to run the quarantine wall, and two, brave enough to deal with the zombies, and two, brave enough to deal with the zombies, and three, just had the desire to go in and do it, who thought along those lines. So I had a heist picture kind of in my head. It was, and I knew eventually some story would take that form. And when I got an opportunity to do Flesh Eaters, because Dead City and Apocalypse of the Dead both did really well, and so they wanted a third one. And I knew I wanted to go back to that. But I also needed to tell the story clearly of how this evolved. And I wanted a chance to use my training as a disaster mitigation specialist. So put on all those things together, it occurred to me, well, we have to tell the prelude or the prequel to Dead City. And so that's where this book comes from. It shows the hurricanes coming in, Houston by degrees being swallowed up by the Gulf of Mexico, basically, and the geography of the Gulf Coast permanently changing as a result of this disaster. And in the flooded ruins, as people are trying to get out, we have the heist story coming in as sort of the story element that binds our characters together. And so that's where it came from. That heist element was really the seed for the whole story.
Well, I really enjoyed the story. Of course, I've read all the series and watched them evolved, and I really enjoyed the characters because they leap off the pages. They're very realistic. They are, to quote, if you would, they are the heroes and the demons, I guess, of society. From what that would happen. But you know, I wish you great success with Flesh Eaters. I don't know if you know how well it's doing at this point since it just came out.
It's a little early still to kind of gauge, but I know that it's been back to the well for another printing, so that seems to be a pretty good indicator.
That's awesome. I'm gonna shift gears for just a second. I wanted to go back to one of your stories, Dodging Bullets.
Okay.
One of your crime story. Joe, tell us about Dodging Bullets.
Dodging Bullets, as a policeman, I get asked all the time, why don't you write crime fiction? And it's a love of mine, and it hasn't taken up as much of my professional writing time as zombies, obviously, and horror in general. But it is a love of mine and something that I'll always write, because crime fiction is, again, it's what I love to read growing up, and my problem is getting away from the police procedural element. Obviously, I could write it with a great deal of verisimilitude, but I don't know if real police activity would come across on the page as dramatically as it does on TV, where they get one case a week, and it always ends with a good tearjerker at the end, or whatever it is. So in writing crime fiction, I wanted to kind of stay away from the true police procedural. I wanted to dance on the edges of that. And I have a good friend, Matt Lewis, who runs Out of the Gutter magazine, and he'd given me an opportunity to write some crime fiction for his magazine. Did 2 stories, one, The Millstone, which is one of my all-time favorite stories of mine that I've written, and Dodging Bullets was the other one. And when he started Gutter Books, he said, I want Dodging Bullets as a novel to kind of kick off our novel line. And I was flattered.
So we're going to see more of this then, Joe? I mean...
We will see more crime fiction, definitely.
Okay.
I have a lot to do with crime fiction still. A lot of areas that I haven't played with yet that I have room for. Dodging Bullets, though, was special in that it took me back to my college days in a way. I had it deals with, obviously, the underbelly of San Antonio's heroin community and things like that, which wasn't part of my college upbringing, but the area where this story takes place is in the Monte Vista area, which is right around Trinity University, where I went to college. And it was an opportunity to remember those times. I had a blast in college, and so it was an opportunity to set a story in there and deal with that environment. And I hope it comes across on the page how much the nostalgia of that time.
Oh, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I mean, there's a lot of these short stories. I was pleased when you had put on your website the short story and the teaser, if you will. And that was a really good story, and so this was greatly anticipated. Now you just harping on the new stuff. You just released at the convention. So you've just released the Red Empire.
Right.
I haven't seen it. I haven't read page 1. So obviously, let's go ahead and touch on the Red Empire a little bit here.
Well, that came out yesterday, and I love this story mainly because it gave me an opportunity again to play with an area of horror that I've always enjoyed but haven't written yet. And this one, I absolutely love the creature feature films from the 50s, and this is my homage to those.
Okay.
In here we have giant sentient fire ants, and these fire ants are the U.S. Army's biological weapon against insurgents and fighting in areas of the world where battle lines are blurry at best, and so the U.S. Army invents these sentient fire ants who can essentially fight the war all the time and constantly, and and be an instrument of insidious warfare, basically. And so that's the idea where the Red Empire comes from. And as the truck that is transporting this experiment, this colony of sentient fire ants, as they're traveling across the West Texas desert, they run into a flash flood. The truck gets capsized and washed down the river, and out come these sentient fire ants to do what they were created for. That just so happens they're doing it, in an area where they weren't meant to be released. And so we have sentient fire ants. I throw in a mom and her blind daughter, which is where the cover comes from.
Oh, okay.
And then also an escaped federal prisoner on the loose. And the next thing you know, we've got these three plot lines converging on each other. And so I hope that people will read it, and when they finish it, will feel exhausted from the sprint. Because that's what this book is intended to be, is a sprint from page 1 to...
Now, was this adapted from a short story of
No.
yours, or was this just you sat down one day and
it reads fast, and it was written fast. I sat down with, I had the idea, and I believe the rough draft, it's 140, 150 pages. It's a short novel. But I think it took probably 6 days to write.
Wow.
And it was just, like I said, it reads like a sprint, and it was written like a sprint. And it just poured out. I've had a few stories that I sat down and oh, I'm done, and that it just poured out of the pen like that. And that one was one of them. That's probably the longest thing I've ever written that just jumped onto the page.
Wow.
So, and every writer loves those moments, and I certainly do too. So I loved the experience of writing that one. It was fun.
Well, the artwork's also very interesting. Do you have a lot of say so in your artwork when you do it, or do you let the artist just create? And
it's really a function of the publisher. This particular publisher, Bad Moon Books, puts out a beautiful product, and they gave me an opportunity to have some input on kind of what I thought the cover was going to be. And you really want something that not only grabs the reader, but also conveys thematically some central image of the story. And that was one of the few times that I've ever had the opportunity to have some real input on what goes on the cover. For my mass market stuff, they hand you the cover and say, "Hey, this is what the cover of your book will look like." And, great. So that's the norm. This is an exception to the rule.
Well, that's going to be exciting to be able to turn out a novel that you're not only pleased with in the time frame that you created it, but have a say so in the artwork. So